April 1945. The war in Europe is gasping its final breaths. On a gray morning near the Rhine, fog clings to the torn landscape. The smell of burnt wood, diesel, and cold earth fills the air. The sound of boots scraping mud replaces gunfire. From the distance, a line of men emerges. They wear faded Feldgrau uniforms, their belts loosened, rifles slung upside down. The silent signal of surrender. Most are little more than shadows of soldiers, cheeks hollow, eyes sunken, stomachs caved in from weeks without food. Some clutch frostbitten hands. Others drag their wounded feet through the muck. Across a shallow field, a squad of American infantry waits. Weapons lowered, but fingers tense on the trigger. The young GIs watch as the Germans approach, expecting resistance, deception, perhaps a last-ditch ambush. But instead, one of the German soldiers collapses face first into the mud. The man behind him kneels, raising trembling hands, not in defiance, but in desperation. Brot, bitte. Bread, please. What followed was not another firefight, but a quiet exchange of rations, of compassion, in a world built on destruction. By the start of 1945, the German Reich was no longer a fighting nation. It was a nation trying to survive its own destruction. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had thundered across Europe only 5 years earlier, was now a fractured army of weary men, stretched thin across a ruined continent. Every mile they retreated brought them closer not to safety, but to starvation. The Allied advance into Germany was relentless. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last desperate gamble in December 1944, the Western Front had crumbled. American, British, and Canadian forces poured across the Siegfried Line, advancing into the Rhineland with overwhelming artillery, air superiority, and logistical support. What had once been fortified German soil now became a wasteland of cratered villages and broken bridges. Civilians fled in every direction, many finding themselves caught between retreating German units and the advancing Allies. By March, German supply lines had all but collapsed. Allied bombing campaigns had reduced the country's railway network to twisted metal. Oil depots, rail yards, and factories were nothing but smoking ruins. Entire towns were cut off from food deliveries. Army depots stood empty. The once efficient logistics machine of the Wehrmacht was paralyzed. German soldiers scavenged whatever they could. Frozen potatoes, the last cans of horse meat, or even bread scraped from the pockets of the dead. Many had not eaten properly in days. At the front lines, discipline eroded. Soldiers traded ammunition for food, stripped fallen comrades of boots or blankets, and marched barefoot across the cold fields of the Rhineland. Letters home spoke not of glory or courage, but of hunger. "We have nothing left," wrote one private of the 6th Panzer Army in late March 1945. "We eat grass like animals. We dream of bread." Meanwhile, the Allied forces were operating at a scale Germany could no longer match. Supply trucks followed every advance, bringing hot meals, cigarettes, and medical care. American soldiers could rotate out of combat, eat canned meat, and receive mail from home. The contrast was staggering. Two armies now fighting under entirely different conditions. One fought for survival, the other for conclusion. For German units defending the western banks of the Rhine, the situation turned hopeless after the Allies captured the Ludendorffy Bridge at Remagen in early March. The U.S. 9th Farmer und Faith Armored Division's daring seizure of the bridge created a permanent crossing point into the heart of Germany. Within days, Allied engineers reinforced it, and thousands of troops began pouring eastward. The Reich's final natural barrier had fallen. What remained of the Wehrmacht in the west was no longer an organized fighting force. Entire divisions existed only on paper. Teenagers and old men filled the ranks, many carrying rifles older than they were. The Volkssturm, Hitler's People's Militia, was deployed in desperation, often without uniforms or training. They were sent to defend positions that no longer mattered, against an enemy that no longer needed to fight hard to win. Yet the human spirit, even in its final exhaustion, clung to survival. In many small pockets of resistance, German officers attempted to maintain order, issuing commands to hold until the last bullet. But most soldiers ignored them. When American tanks approached, thousands chose to surrender rather than die for a cause they no longer believed in. And when they did, they often arrived unarmed, waving white rags, their faces gray with hunger. For American troops, this was a strange sight. They had been taught to fear the German army, to expect fanatic resistance. Yet here they were, facing men who could barely stand. The smell of hunger hung heavy in the air. The war that had once seemed unstoppable was collapsing into silence, broken only by the rustle of surrendering men and the hum of Allied trucks. As April approached, the scale of surrender grew so vast that even high command took notice. Eisenhower's staff estimated that by the end of the month, nearly 1 million German soldiers would lay down their arms in the West alone. But what few reports mentioned was the condition in which many arrived, emaciated, exhausted, and begging not for mercy, but for food. And that, more than tactics, more than firepower, defined the final days of the German army. For the American soldier in Europe, 1945 was a paradox. The war was nearly won, but the brutality hadn't ended. After months of relentless combat through Normandy, the Ardennes, and into the Rhineland, many GIs had seen enough death to numb them for life. Yet, as they advanced deeper into Germany, they encountered something they hadn't expected. An enemy who had lost everything, including the will to fight. The U.S. Army, by contrast, was a model of abundance. Its supply network stretched back across the English Channel to the docks of Britain, and from there, across the Atlantic. Each division carried vast logistical tail units, trucks of fuel, food, and ammunition, ensuring that frontline soldiers were rarely without rations. Even at the edge of the front, a GI could open a can of Spam, brew instant coffee, or unwrap a Hershey bar. Such small comforts became symbols of a modern army's reach and efficiency. But they also became symbols of something else, the staggering contrast between victors and defeated. When surrendering Germans staggered into American lines, they were often too weak to speak. Their uniforms hung loose. Some had feet wrapped in rags instead of boots. Many carried no weapons, no packs, and no supplies, just the universal plea of starvation in their eyes. The U.S. Army had been briefed on how to treat prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention. Orders from Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, (SHEF), emphasized discipline and decency. POWs were to be disarmed, processed, and fed when possible. American commanders knew that how they treated the defeated enemy would define post-war Europe as much as victory itself. Still, on the ground, the reality was personal. The decisions were made not in headquarters, but by small groups of young soldiers, often 19 or 20 years old, standing in ruined fields and bombed-out villages. They faced choices their training could not prepare them for. What to do when an enemy collapses at your feet, asking for bread. Some remembered their own hardships. Many of these GIs had lived through the Great Depression. They knew hunger and what it did to a man. Others recalled the faces of captured American soldiers in German camps, starved and beaten. And yet, in those final weeks, the instinct for revenge softened under the weight of what they saw. The men in front of them were no longer the enemy. They were just human beings, stripped of war's illusions. American field kitchens became quiet symbols of mercy. Cooks preparing rations for their own troops sometimes set aside portions for prisoners. Thin soup, black bread, or coffee. Military police and medics distributed what they could. Cigarettes, chocolate, even spare boots. Official reports describe these moments as spontaneous humanitarian acts, though most went unrecorded, passed only by memory and word of mouth. One Army chaplain in the 90th Infantry Division wrote, "We had been trained to destroy, but when we saw them, the beaten, the hollow ones, something inside us changed. We shared what we had, and for the first time, we felt like victors." By mid-April 1945, surrender had become the defining rhythm of the front. Columns of German soldiers, sometimes hundreds at a time, walked toward American lines carrying makeshift white flags, handkerchiefs, torn shirts, even bed sheets tied to rifles. American units were often overwhelmed by the sheer number of prisoners. Improvised holding areas filled with men who had no strength left to resist or even to stand. And in those places, bread, the simplest human gift, became the most powerful symbol of all. The stage was set for one of the quietest, yet most human chapters of the Second World War. Not a battle, not a victory parade, but a moment where compassion rose above vengeance, and young men on opposite sides of history broke bread instead of breaking lives. And it would play out in the heart of Germany, in places like the Ruhr Valley, where starvation and surrender converged into history's final act. Before the gunfire ceased, hunger had already done what Allied firepower could not. It broke the German army from within. Across the Western Front, the collapse of logistics turned soldiers into wanderers. Units that once prided themselves on precision and discipline now resembled displaced families. Rations disappeared weeks before formal surrender orders ever reached them. For many, the last meals were scavenged from abandoned farms or whatever could be boiled from frozen fields. Diaries and letters recovered after the war reveal a haunting truth. Hunger erased ideology. Soldiers who had sworn oaths to fight for the Reich began surrendering not out of fear, but because they simply could not endure another day without food. In some areas, German officers allowed their men to abandon positions just to search for something edible. One veteran later wrote, "We no longer cared who won. We only wanted something to eat." When these starving men reached American lines, the war ended not with gunfire, but with trembling hands reaching for bread. It was the most basic of human exchanges, nourishment for surrender. Yet it carried a weight far beyond the moment. For the first time since 1939, German soldiers were seen not as symbols of aggression, but as broken human beings, victims of the very system they once served. Hunger, more than any battle, stripped them of their warlike identity. And in that silent defeat, a strange kind of peace began to emerge. The American angle, between duty and compassion for American troops. The sight of surrendering Germans was both relief and moral confusion. They had been trained to fight, to shoot first, to distrust any enemy trick. Memories of ambushes and false surrenders were fresh. Countless soldiers had been killed by Germans pretending to yield. So when columns of enemy troops appeared waving white flags, the instinct was to keep rifles ready. But what they saw in the spring of 1945 was different. These were not the disciplined German formations of Normandy or the Ardennes. These were gaunt, hollow-eyed men, often barefoot, with empty canteens and shaking hands. Their weapons were dropped in ditches, their belts unbuckled, their eyes unfocused. They were not advancing. They were collapsing forward. Private William H. Green of the 9th Infantry recalled in a post-war interview, "They looked like ghosts. You could tell they hadn't eaten in days. One of them held up his helmet like a bowl, begging for something. My buddy poured in some of his soup ration. The man drank it right there, kneeling in the mud." Acts like these were never planned. They emerged from instinct, a shared recognition of suffering that transcended sides. American soldiers, surrounded by abundance, began giving away portions of their own field rations. Some quietly disobeyed orders to conserve supplies, handing out chocolate bars or bread when officers weren't looking. Others shared cigarettes, blankets, or even photographs of family. Small gestures that seemed to rebuild a sense of humanity in the ruins around them. Yet there was also unease. Every act of mercy carried risk. Medics warned against feeding prisoners too quickly. Some were so starved that sudden meals could kill them. Commanders feared that compassion might undermine discipline. Still, most GIs didn't think of policy. They simply acted as humans first, soldiers second. The U.S. Army, with its industrial-scale efficiency, had marched across Europe fueled by logistics and strategy. But in those final weeks, victory took on a quieter form. Not in captured towns or destroyed divisions, but in the moment, a soldier decided to share his bread instead of his bullet. One American chaplain described it in his journal. For months, we had been fighting to end evil. But at the end, we realized, defeating evil isn't just about killing it. It's about refusing to become it. That sentiment, rarely spoken aloud, defined the emotional tone of April 1945. The Americans were not merely conquering Germany. They were learning how to be victors without losing their humanity. City-Hon, word of these surrenders spread through Allied units. The war began to change in character. Skirmishes became lines of prisoners. Villages that once echoed with shell fire now filled with the sound of boots shuffling in surrender. For many American soldiers, this transformation from killing to compassion felt stranger than the war itself. The chaos of battle was giving way to the stillness of conscience. And as soldiers adjusted to this new reality, deeper questions began to surface about morality, command, and what it meant to remain human after years of inhumanity. War, by its nature, dehumanizes. It demands that men see one another as targets, not as individuals. Yet, in the fading spring light of 1945, something extraordinary occurred. Soldiers on both sides remembered what it meant to be human. In the ruined villages of the Ruhr and the Rhineland, German prisoners sat on the ground in silence, some too weak to lift their heads. Nearby, American soldiers handed out sea rations and water from their canteens. It was an image almost biblical in its simplicity. Victors feeding the defeated. This act of compassion wasn't born of politics or orders. It was born of instinct. Many GIs could not look at the starved faces of their enemies without recognizing a mirror of their own vulnerability. The war had stripped everyone, German or American, of comfort, family, and certainty. But in the offering of food, the thin line between enemy and man blurred. The morality of it was complex. Some officers worried that showing kindness weakened the image of control. Others saw it differently, as the purest expression of civilization surviving within chaos. An American captain from the 104th Infantry later said, "The moment we gave them food, they stopped being the enemy. They became people again, and that's how I knew the war was really ending." In these small, unrecorded exchanges, a greater moral victory was taking place, one that could never be measured by captured cities or destroyed tanks. It was the victory of empathy over ideology, a silent protest against the brutality that had consumed the continent. The strategic angle. The surrender that accelerated victory. The Tour. American advance across the Rhine in March and April 1945 was the final act of a war already decided by logistics and air power. But the massive wave of German surrenders, driven largely by starvation and exhaustion, drastically accelerated the Allied timetable. Entire corps surrendered without resistance. In the Ruhr Pocket alone, nearly 325,000 German soldiers laid down their arms between April 4th and April 18th. For comparison, that was larger than the entire German army defending Normandy the previous summer. The fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht had simply evaporated. Hunger had not only broken morale, It had dissolved the chain of command. Officers could no longer enforce discipline when men were fainting from malnutrition. The logistical collapse meant that German divisions were starving faster than they were being defeated. It was not the bullet that ended their war. It was the empty stomach. The Americans recognized this and adapted quickly. Field commanders shifted focus from combat operations to prisoner management. Divisions like the 1st, 9th, and 99th Infantry were ordered to prepare temporary camps for the tidal wave of POWs flooding their sectors. Engineers repurposed farm fields and meadows into holding areas, surrounded by barbed wire, often without tents or infrastructure. The goal was no longer destruction. It was containment. Every German who surrendered meant one less firefight, one less dead American, one step closer to the inevitable. Compassion, in a sense, became strategy. Feeding prisoners kept them calm. Allowing humane treatment prevented riots or escape attempts. What had begun as spontaneous mercy among soldiers became, quietly, a tool of stabilization. And behind the front, Allied intelligence realized something more profound. Surrendering Germans talked. Hungry men fed by their captors were often willing to share information about troop movements, supply shortages, and morale. Kindness, even unintentionally, became a weapon of information. The war in the West was now ending not through annihilation, but through exhaustion, and the unexpected weapon was empathy. The psychological angle, healing through humanity for the soldiers themselves, those quiet moments of mercy became emotional anchors in a world otherwise defined by destruction. American troops who had spent months in brutal combat, watching friends die in hedgerows, villages, and forests, now faced an emotional paradox. How could they feed men who, only weeks earlier, had tried to kill them? And yet, many later admitted that it brought them a sense of peace they hadn't felt since before the war. The act of giving, a crust of bread, a sip of coffee, a shared cigarette, was a small rebellion against everything war had demanded of them. It reminded them that they were still human. As one soldier of the 2nd Armored Division later wrote, "That day, I stopped hating them. We were all just tired men who wanted to go home." On the German side, the psychological impact was equally profound. Captured soldiers who expected abuse instead found decency. In their letters and memoirs, many described disbelief, that the enemy treated them with more compassion than their own leadership ever had. It shattered years of propaganda and sowed the earliest seeds of post-war reconciliation. In the prisoner camps that followed, where American guards sometimes shared coffee or cigarettes with their captives, an unspoken understanding grew. The war had ended not just militarily, but morally. Compassion had survived. And that, in itself, was victory. By late April 1945, the Western Front had fallen silent except for the rumble of trucks, moving prisoners westward and refugees eastward. The great clash of nations was shrinking into the quiet heartbeat of survival. The war's final chapter was being written not in explosions, but in gestures, a loaf of bread, a helping hand, a shared silence between former enemies, and soon, in one of the largest mass surrenders in military history, the Ruhr Pocket. Those gestures would define the closing act of the European War. April 1945. The industrial heart of Germany. The Ruhr Valley had become a prison of steel and hunger. Once the beating center of German war production, coal mines, steel mills, and armament factories, it was now a shattered wasteland encircled by Allied armies. The trap closed swiftly. In late March, General Omar Bradley's 12th U.S. Army Group advanced from the west, while British Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group pressed from the north. Inside the tightening circle stood Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, once one of Hitler's most trusted tacticians. Nearly 325,000 German troops, remnants of 19 divisions, found themselves surrounded in what would soon be called the Ruhr Pocket. At first, Hitler demanded resistance to the last man. Radio orders from Berlin spoke of holding the industrial fortress at all costs. But the reality on the ground made those words meaningless. The soldiers trapped in the pocket were starving. Fuel was gone, ammunition scarce, and supply columns obliterated by Allied aircraft. Entire units ran out of food by the first week of April. Civilians who had fled into the pocket joined the soldiers in scouring fields for turnips or slaughtering farm animals. The tree. American encirclement tightened daily. From the west, elements of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies pushed deeper into the valley, capturing town after town, Essen, Hagen, Wuppertal, all reduced to rubble by months of bombing. Resistance, when it appeared, was short and desperate. Isolated German officers tried to rally their men, but hunger and exhaustion hollowed every command. American troops began encountering German soldiers who no longer fought back. They emerged from woods or factories waving white rags, many carrying their helmets in their hands as a sign of surrender. Some stumbled toward American lines without weapons, their hands raised but shaking from weakness rather than fear. In one report from the 79th Infantry Division near Essen, an American patrol described the scene. They came out in small groups, barely standing. Their faces were gray, lips cracked. They had nothing left to fight with, not even the will. As the front disintegrated, Field Marshal Model refused to surrender formally. Known as the Führer's fireman, he had built his reputation on defending collapsing fronts. But now even he recognized the futility. In a final address to his officers, Model admitted that the situation was hopeless, yet forbade them from surrendering to avoid Hitler's wrath. Many of his subordinates quietly ignored the order. Between April 10th and April 17th, the collapse became total. Thousands of German soldiers, infantry, tank crews, and Luftwaffe ground personnel streamed into Allied lines. The American army faced logistical chaos. Entire fields near Remscheid, Ludenscheid, and Hagen turned into improvised POW camps, each holding tens of thousands. But amid the confusion, remarkable moments unfolded. Reports from the U.S. 95th Infantry Division tell of German prisoners so hungry that they collapsed upon arrival. Medics distributed water, while GIs handed out whatever food they had, crackers, chocolate, even rations torn in half to share. One corporal wrote home, "We gave them bread. They ate like they hadn't seen food in months. I couldn't hate them anymore." In some units, American cooks extended their kitchens to feed hundreds of prisoners at a time. They filled metal buckets with hot soup, passing them down the rows of captives. The silence that followed was eerie. Thousands of defeated soldiers eating in near-total quiet, broken only by the clatter of tin cups and the crackle of distant artillery. For many Americans, the Ruhr surrender became a moment of reflection. They had spent years fighting the image of the German soldier as an unstoppable, disciplined machine, the enemy who had conquered Europe. Yet here they stood, surrounded by starving men whose only remaining request was for food. It was not triumph that filled the air, but something far more complex: pity, relief, and disbelief all at once. One sergeant from the 2nd Infantry Division recorded in his journal, "It felt like the world had stopped fighting for a moment. We were all just people again, tired, dirty, and done with it." When Field Marshal Model finally dissolved Army Group B and released his men from their oaths on April 17th, the war in Western Germany was effectively over. He would take his own life days later rather than surrender. His soldiers, now without command, streamed toward Allied lines by the tens of thousands. By April 18th, more than 325,000 German troops had laid down their arms. One of the largest mass surrenders in military history. Yet the most powerful legacy of the Ruhr was not just in numbers. It was in the sight of American soldiers, surrounded by their enemies. choosing compassion over vengeance. And in the final days of that massive surrender, another wave of such moments would unfold, when victory met humanity face to face, and men learned that even in war's end, kindness could rewrite history. In the second week of April 1945, as the Ruhr Pocket unraveled completely, the front lines ceased to exist in any traditional sense. American patrols no longer advanced through gunfire. They walked through crowds of surrendering soldiers. The air smelled of damp earth, diesel smoke, and unwashed bodies. The thunder of artillery faded into an eerie stillness, broken only by the sound of boots, the murmur of thousands, and the creak of vehicles overloaded with prisoners. To those who lived through it, the silence was more unsettling than battle. "You could hear men breathing," recalled Private Charles M. Atkins of the 99th Infantry Division. "We were surrounded by Germans, not fighting, just waiting. Waiting for food, for capture, for the end of everything." In makeshift camps along the Ruhr River, American soldiers found themselves tending to captives instead of fighting them. The scale defied imagination. Over 300,000 prisoners meant improvised organization. Barbed wire fences built overnight, field kitchens stretched beyond capacity, medics treating hundreds at a time for malnutrition and dysentery. It was not victory in the glorious sense. It was administrative mercy on an industrial scale. One war correspondent described entering a captured German position near Hagen. They were lying everywhere, asleep on the ground, helmets beside them. They looked like boys. When an American soldier offered them bread, they reached for it with tears in their eyes. It was the first thing they trusted in weeks. For some Americans, this compassion came naturally. For others, it conflicted deeply with everything they'd endured. The memories of the Battle of the Bulge and the sight of murdered Allied prisoners still haunted many. The emotional weight of seeing their former enemies in such ruin was almost unbearable. A private from the 30th Infantry Division admitted later, "Part of me wanted to hate them. The other part saw my own brother in their faces." There was no single order that told American troops to act mercifully. It was spontaneous, almost instinctive. In some units, the feeding of prisoners became a daily ritual. Cooks ladled thin stew into helmets repurposed as bowls. Field medics distributed glucose tablets to men who could barely stand. When supply ran short, soldiers broke apart their own rations, having chocolate bars, or pouring coffee into shared cups. In the village of Wetter, west of Dortmund, American officers found a group of German soldiers sheltering in a barn. 30 men, too weak to move. They hadn't eaten in 5 days. The Americans set up a fire and boiled water, making soup from field rations. Witnesses later recalled that when the smell of food filled the air, several Germans began to cry. One whispered, "Ich dachte, ihr würdet uns erschießen." "I thought you would shoot us." Instead, they were fed. Moments like these repeated across the collapsing front. Quiet, unrecorded acts of decency in a war that had long since lost its humanity. In every story, the pattern was the same. An army that once embodied terror was now too weak to lift its weapons, and an army that once fought it found compassion in its strength. Even officers hardened by years of combat were moved. Colonel Benjamin Jacobs, commander of a U.S. engineer regiment near Ludenscheid, wrote to his wife after the war, "I never imagined feeding the enemy would feel like victory. But when I saw our boys giving away their rations, I realized this is how wars should end. Not with hatred, but with mercy." Meanwhile, in the Allied High Command, the surrender created a logistical nightmare. Eisenhower's staff scrambled to process hundreds of thousands of POWs. But among the paperwork and reports, something intangible emerged. The understanding that this end, though chaotic, was humane. No mass executions, no reprisals, no collapse into revenge. Just weary soldiers surrendering to a power that chose decency over destruction. By April 17th, the Ruhr Pocket was gone. The last organized German resistance dissolved as Model's remaining divisions surrendered en masse. Columns of soldiers, vehicles, and civilians stretched for miles. From the air, reconnaissance pilots reported a surreal sight. A landscape filled not with movement or fighting, but with stillness. Fields covered in soldiers sitting cross-legged, waiting to be captured. American forces, overwhelmed but steady, processed them one group at a time. The same soldiers who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Siegfried Line now found themselves performing a final, deeply human duty, feeding their enemies. A U.S. medic summed it up in his field diary. "We came here to end a war. Maybe, just maybe, we ended something worse. The part of us that forgot what mercy was." As April turned to May, word of Germany's surrender spread, and the guns finally fell silent. But for those who had lived through the Ruhr, the memory that stayed was not of the final battle. It was of the moment compassion eclipsed vengeance. The war had reached its turning point, not in blood, but in bread. In the weeks that followed the fall of the Ruhr Pocket, Western Germany became a land of silence, the kind of silence that follows exhaustion rather than peace. Villages no longer echoed with artillery or shouted orders, but with the clatter of empty mess tins and the murmur of men waiting to be processed. The Allied front had stopped moving, not because of resistance, but because there was no one left to fight. The numbers were staggering. By the end of April 1945, nearly 325,000 German troops had surrendered inside the Ruhr, the single largest capitulation on the Western Front. The U.S. Ninth and First Armies suddenly found themselves responsible for feeding, guarding, and sheltering more prisoners than any force in modern history. For every American soldier, there were nearly 5 Germans behind barbed wire. The result was an immense humanitarian and logistical strain. Field kitchens burned day and night, turning out gallons of weak soup and coffee. Ammunition trucks were repurposed to deliver bread and canned meat. Makeshift POW enclosures spread across open farmland. Fenced-in meadows filled with men sleeping under rain-soaked blankets, some still wearing their helmets as pillows. Military reports described the situation as controlled chaos. Eisenhower's headquarters ordered that prisoners be treated according to the Geneva Convention, but supplies were thin, transportation was scarce, and medical care was overwhelmed. Yet, despite the disarray, the spirit among the Americans remained remarkably restrained. Lieutenant Robert C. Duncan of the 84th Infantry Division later recalled, "We could have hated them easily after the Ardennes, after seeing what they did in Belgium. But when they surrendered to us starving, there wasn't hate left, only pity." The war was already gone out of them. Many German prisoners themselves couldn't comprehend the treatment they received. After years of Nazi propaganda portraying Allied troops as monsters, the act of being handed food by an American soldier felt unreal. Some refused to eat at first, suspecting poison. Others broke down in tears, murmuring thanks in broken English. In captured diaries and letters found later, countless German soldiers wrote of that disbelief. One read simply, "They gave us bread." I will never forget this, but compassion alone couldn't erase the suffering. Conditions in some of the larger temporary camps, particularly near Remagen and Sinzig, became desperate. The influx of hundreds of thousands of prisoners overwhelmed even the best-prepared divisions. Heavy spring rains turned fields into mud pits, and sanitation was almost impossible. American officers, faced with the impossible balance between mercy and survival, struggled to keep order while preventing disease and starvation. Still, many of the men guarding the camps did what they could. Soldiers shared cigarettes, blankets, and portions of their own rations. Chaplains visited both sides, comforting prisoners and weary guards alike. For a moment, The front lines of war had blurred into something else entirely, a fragile fraternity born from shared exhaustion. Elsewhere in Germany, civilians began to see the same transformation. The American occupation in the West was firm but measured. Soldiers who had once fought street by street now found themselves directing traffic, helping rebuild bridges, or distributing food to families whose homes had been destroyed. The same hands that had held rifles now handed out loaves of bread and tins of Spam. This uneasy peace revealed something profound about the human condition. For 6 years, the world had been defined by destruction. Yet, in these closing days, the first acts of reconstruction began not with treaties or speeches, but with gestures of mercy between enemies. The war was ending, but the moral questions it raised about vengeance, justice, and compassion had only just begun to surface. The men who shared their rations that April didn't know it then, but history would remember their actions not as a footnote of surrender, but as a quiet testament to humanity's endurance amid collapse. And as the last columns of German prisoners were marched west toward holding camps in France, the Americans left behind in the Ruhr turned their eyes east, toward the Elbe, toward Berlin, where another, even larger surrender awaited. By early May 1945, the Ruhr's once proud industrial heart lay in silence. Steelworks that had fueled the Reich stood cold and lifeless. The air, once blackened by smoke and flame, now hung heavy with the smell of wet ash and damp earth. Every bridge across the Rhine was in ruins, and every road was lined with the remnants of surrender. Broken helmets, abandoned rifles, field packs scattered like leaves after a storm. For the Allied command, the surrender of the Ruhr marked the collapse of organized German resistance in the West. Within weeks, the British, Canadians, and Americans had taken more than 1.5 million prisoners across Germany. It was the beginning of the end, not through conquest alone, but through the sheer exhaustion of a nation that could no longer fight. In those vast prison camps, the Germans waited, hungry, silent, uncertain of what awaited them. Some feared execution, others prayed for simple survival. But what they experienced instead was something unexpected: the steady, disciplined compassion of an army that had no reason left to hate. At Rheinberg, an American-run enclosure holding nearly 100,000 prisoners, guards noticed a strange transformation. Former Wehrmacht officers began organizing literacy classes for younger soldiers. Men too weak to stand were carried to medical tents by the same Americans who had once fought them. When food arrived, rations were divided with almost ritual care. A spoon of stew at a time, a crust of bread shared between men who had stopped being enemies. For many American troops, these acts of mercy became a quiet form of redemption. They had seen the worst of war, from Normandy's hedgerows to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and now they wanted to leave something better behind. The violence, the revenge, the fear, it all had to end somewhere. Private Henry Lewis of the 9th Infantry later wrote in a letter home, "We didn't win because we killed more of them. We won because we didn't become what we were fighting." That sentiment echoed through the ranks. In debriefings and post-war interviews, countless soldiers described the same moment. The instant they realized that mercy had replaced hatred. Feeding prisoners, helping civilians, rebuilding bridges, these became their final acts of war. Meanwhile, for the German soldiers who survived the Ruhr and other surrender pockets, captivity became the first step toward reflection. Many would spend months, even years, in Allied camps, working in fields, repairing infrastructure, or simply waiting. But most would later recall that it was in those early days of surrender that they rediscovered something they thought the war had erased: the idea that even an enemy could be human. One former officer of the 116th Panzer Division, interviewed years later, said quietly, "When the American gave me bread, he defeated me more completely than any weapon ever could." Beyond the camps, the story of April 1945 began to shape how history remembered the Western Front. The images of surrendered German troops, hollow-eyed and barefoot, contrasted sharply with the brutality unfolding in the East, where the Soviet advance brought vengeance and chaos. The Americans' restraint in the West became a defining moral line, proof that even amid the ruins of total war, decency could survive. Of course, the war's aftermath was not free of tragedy. Thousands of POWs died from disease, exposure, or malnutrition in overcrowded holding areas before proper facilities could be built. But the intent remained clear. This was not revenge, it was reconstruction. Every act of aid, every shared meal, was a step away from the abyss humanity had teetered on for 6 long years. By the time Germany signed its unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the men of the Ruhr had already written their own quiet ending. They had shown the world that compassion could coexist with victory, that even after millions of deaths, the human spirit could still choose empathy over annihilation. For the young Americans who shared their bread in those muddy fields, it was a moment that stayed with them for life. Some spoke of it only once, others never at all. But in their silence was understanding. That history remembers wars for their battles, yet it is the moments of mercy that define their humanity. And as peace settled over Europe, those who had lived through that April knew one thing for certain. The war had ended not with a roar of triumph, but with the quiet breaking of bread between enemies. History often remembers war by its violence, by the thunder of guns, the blaze of cities, and the final signatures that end it. Yet, what endures longest are rarely the sounds of victory, but the moments of silence that follow. In that silence, in the muddy fields of the Ruhr, in the broken villages along the Rhine, something profoundly human returned. Soldiers who had spent years destroying one another discovered that mercy could feel stronger than any weapon. Bread, not bullets, became the language of surrender. For the Americans, it was the first glimpse of what peace might look like, not through parades or speeches, but through simple decency shared between exhausted men. For the Germans, it was the first lesson of a new world, that the same hands capable of war could also offer compassion. Years later, veterans from both sides would speak of that April with the same tone. Quiet, hesitant, but clear. They remembered the faces more than the flags, the hunger, the trembling hands reaching for food, the realization that, for the first time in years, no one was trying to kill them. It is easy to see wars as the sum of strategies and victories. Harder, but truer, is to see them as collections of choices between hatred and humanity. In the spring of 1945, amid the ruins of Europe, thousands of men made such a choice. The rifles were lowered, the bread was shared, and for one fleeting moment, mercy became the final act of war.